Hi, and welcome to the first in a series of lesson examples for lesson planning with the ELL in mind. Today we're going to look at a 4th grade social studies lesson. It is for the first lesson of a textbook. Please take a few moments to download the lesson plan. Starting with vocabulary, I went through the text several times to find other content obligatory words to add to the designated words by the textbook authors. I also came up with a list of 7 content-compatible words that relate to direction and descriptions of places they have learned in other lessons. I would ask a school volunteer or aide to review these words with ELL students just in case they don't know them. The collocations I chose to focus on are the phrases needed to describe location using the "in the blank." This phrase was used a lot in the unit to describe the location of Native American groups. I have created a supplemental vocabulary sheet for ELL students to complete that focuses on defining the food and handout, matching the Native American group to the food they eat. The grammar structure my ELLs will see throughout this particular chapter is the past tense. So I will monitor their use of this verb tense, especially irregular past tense verbs. If I see a lot of errors, I know that I have to do a mini lesson for my ELLs on the simple past tense. Another grammar structure my students will need to use is the comparative form of adjectives when they describe life today and life 400 years ago. One particular structure my ELL students struggle with is describing nouns. In many languages, the noun comes before the adjective. For example, in English, we say brown house. Many languages would reverse the word order and say house brown. I have designed a handout incorporating practice to use with my ELL students. I would try to carve out about 10 or 15 minutes to go over this with them and have them do the last part of it as independent practice, which is finding examples of the grammar structure in the textbook. Hopefully, the isolated attention to this grammar structure will help ELLs use it correctly. The language functions match my grammar structures. The language I want my ELL students to use correctly in this lesson is describing nouns using the adjective plus noun format. I also want them to compare life today to 400 years ago. Was it easier now? What was more difficult or more exciting 400 years ago? I also want ELLs to correctly express location. For example, the Iroquois lived in the eastern part of the United States. Again, these language functions match the grammar structure and are taken from the context of the book. Next, we move on to the depth of knowledge and the questions. While looking for grammar structures, I notice that all 4 areas of my depth of knowledge are present in my lesson. My activities bring forth the first 3 levels. They become the scaffold for the open questions that I may ask my students at the end of the unit, where they have to think more critically to analyze and synthesize the information. I have identified 4 learning skills for this lesson. They are carry out investigations, cooperate with others, interpret information, and locate directions. Seeing that this is the first unit of the textbook, we can assume that this is the beginning of the school year, which means classroom routines and rules or codes of conduct are being established. Go over your expectations and even model them for students. It's necessary, especially when it comes to working with others. When addressing how to carry out investigations, you may want to suggest assigning each student a role or a turn at participating to ensure everyone has the opportunity to speak and that the activity isn't dominated by one student. Now that I have my learning goals, I need to write my learning objectives and my language objectives. The learning goals refer to the content my students are going to be learning in this unit. Because this is one chapter of a larger unit, I only have 2 learning objectives. By the end of this lesson, the students will be able to describe and differentiate between Native American groups and analyze Native American groups' survival and adaptability to regions. My language objectives come from the key vocabulary, grammar functions, and language functions of my lesson. These 4 objectives focus specifically on my ELL students. Once I have my learning objectives and language objectives completed, I can align them to the standards required by my school. Remember, this course is using standards for the state of Arizona. Please check with your school's administration or curriculum coordinator for what standards you need to use. I have also aligned my language objectives to the English Language Proficiency Standards, or ELP standards. If your district does not have these, they can be found at www.tsol.org. Finally, I begin planning the sequence of learning activities and questions I will use to teach the lesson. I want my ELL students to feel comfortable and have as many opportunities to use English, especially the vocabulary and grammar functions. So I'm having my activities done with partners and small groups, keeping track of how much talk time is spent having students talk and me talk. This lesson is divided up into 2 days, with the end of the first day being after step number 2. Students can read the material and complete their part of the organizer as homework. Then they are prepared to participate in class the next day. If time gets away from you, as it can, there are suggestions for homework to get through questions. I also have not included a summative assessment because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first unit of the text. The summative assessment will come at the end of the unit. The graphic organizer will not only help your ELL students, but the rest of the class as well. I have chosen not to adapt any of the text because after reading it, I felt strongly that it was written clearly, using direct, simple sentences. I want my ELLs to focus on the vocabulary and the adjective plus noun structure. Hopefully these examples of adaptations will get you thinking of what you can do to modify some of your lessons or handouts for your ELL students. Happy lesson planning!